So I've spoken about resilience in a different video, and today I wanted to bring up the resilience that we develop with the things, the traumatized situations that we haven't been able to just shake off like a duck. And naturally, anything that we can deal with before it crystallizes, before it becomes something hard in the body, is easier to get rid of. Just like the saying to get back into the saddle, like they say about people who have fallen off a horse, right? They say that the faster you can get back on that horse again, the better, because then you don't let it become a thing. It doesn't harden, it doesn't crystallize into something fearful and blocked and unnatural. But most of the things that we experienced early on in life, we did not have the intellectual capacity to shake off, actually. Like a duck. So imagine that the very first trauma that we experienced was, well, birth, as it was a disruption in our life from that nice warm cocoon and then coming out into the world. And well, since it's been with us since birth, we are really incapable of even imagining what we would be like without that trauma having come into us. And it's the same with most of the things that we've experienced in the first few years in life. That whole thing is something that I will talk about in another video, because that's a whole thing in itself. But just remembering that all the things that happened to us early on in life that came as a disruption to what our natural flow was traumatic in itself and crystallized inside of us, because we were also a very fertile soil that would just take anything in, register, and let it stay with us in what we would call the subconscious mind, or in the body. We can see this anyway. I mean, when we're small children, we're so open and flexible and moving. And then the more we age, the stiffer we become, the tighter we become, and the more we develop a personality. We become this identity, right? And it becomes a blueprint. It becomes who we are. And what actually happens is that we're developing resilience to life in itself. We adapt into things, we grow, and we continue. And just like the tree, we find another way. When we can't grow that way because the mountain's there, we'll go the other way or we'll follow it. And so in a way, it's our way to adapt into things. And resilience in itself is actually our capacity to adapt to a situation in a way that it's not just a question of survival, but that we can actually, from survival, thrive in the conditions that we've ended up in. And that's really what resilience in itself is. And very often we are more or less just surviving, actually. In the Western point of view, all of this is being named basically developmental psychology. Different kinds of theories around that. And then in the Eastern view, or the yogic view, not only the yogis actually, but in the Eastern view, for instance, in yoga, we kind of have this explained through the chakra system, because that's also how developed differently from the beginning and from what it is today. But just like everything else, everything develops actually and changes constantly, just like a language changes constantly as well. But we have now this idea about the chakras and how we have different things that we attribute to the chakras in terms of emotional maturity and growth. And so the person that you are today is this being that has been adapting in order to survive, adapting in situations where we were blocked in the natural flow of life, and then that hardened us, we crystallized it, became something, find our way around it, and then continuing. And so we develop the way we deal with people, for instance, and situations according to these experiences. It's important to realize that the person that you are today, you are that person because of everything that you've been through. You are actually the person you are today due to what you had for dinner last night. And if you would have had a different meal, you would have been a little bit different. So everything that happens to you is a new piece in the puzzle, if you will. I'm doing this because I've got the original article lying behind it, so I just want to remember some of the things that I had written down as I was talking about this. Now, when this becomes an issue, actually, because I think that it doesn't have to become an issue, but mostly it does become an issue because the way we then end up in our this identity is to feel almost claustrophobic in it by the blocking, the tightness that we've created around it. When we realize that it has its limits, when we realize that we might act in certain ways that isn't really beneficial, because we keep going after this kind of molded idea of who we have become. And so the very first thing, as anything else, is to start from where you are at. Okay, and that means accepting that this is actually who you are today. This is actually what's going on with you. Because you see, if we don't accept, then what we do is that we just keep resisting, which is the case for most people who don't really want to deal with it, actually. Maybe say you want to deal with it, but you don't really want to, and you don't really do it. What you're actually doing in that case is that you're not accepting what is. You're resisting it. You don't really want to deal with it, so you keep resisting it. But unfortunately, the more you resist it, the more you will feel blocked because you're going even more than against this natural flow. So the first step is to say, okay, I accept that this is where I am at. It's this, the whole thing about the 12 steps program, kind of like, my name is so-and-so and I'm an alcoholic. It's kind of like, start with accepting that you have a problem, is what they say. So basically, the first step is acceptance of who am I and where I'm at right now with myself. As soon as I start accepting, all of a sudden there's a flow that begins, because you stop a little bit that resisting that you keep holding on, that keeps eating so much of your energy as well. And this is where the real work then begins. There are different ways of dealing with this work, and you can use the different tools that different spiritual practices, because that's really what it is. The different spiritual practices are kind of offering you tools to deal with this situation where you are a hard shell, and that shell is actually becoming a claustrophobic shell for you that you need to break free from in order to be able to breathe. And that's what the resilience is. The resilience is, I'm learning to adapt into this, but I'm learning to adapt more than to survive. I'm learning to thrive in the situation. And so if you will start with anything that begins by getting to know who you really are behind the shell, that's when you start to choose the road of developing resilience instead of just surviving in your environment. And I have made several articles and videos around these different blockages that we have. That would be, things like the limiting beliefs that we have, the addictions that we develop, and all of that. So I'm not going to go further into that right now, because these are just there's a whole video to do in itself about that, and especially the part where we develop these behaviors that we get stuck on, that we also call addictions. That will be a whole course in itself as well. When we talk about self-love, it is exactly this, actually. It's not really that fluffy, pamper yourself, or even the kind of selfishness of, well, I need to speak my truth, and this is who I am, and this is my self-love. There's truth in that, but that's not really what self-love is. To love means to accept fully as a whole, no matter what, right? Unconditional loving is, I take you for everything that you are, good and bad, and I will love you anyway. And so self-love actually means this. So I'm accepting myself fully as I am, with all the flaws that I have, and I will not check out from myself, even when the flaws come up to the surface. And When do I check out from myself? It's when I distract myself, so I don't really want to be with myself. I go on social media, I have a cigarette, I have a drink, I have a drug, whatever. All of that is checking out from yourself, and it's the opposite to accepting oneself. I'm still resisting when I'm on these things, so I'm not really taking things further. And some of these things can be so hard, I can drag them with me for a very, very long time on my own journey before I manage to let go of them. Okay. I just wanted to say one thing as well about shadow work. So I was saying that there's tools that spiritual practices offers us in order to break down the shell and in order to find resilience, as in to thrive instead of just surviving. One part of all of this, which is also something that I will do a whole part of itself on because it's very, very big, and it's what we call shadow work. So all that whole thing, that's what I wanted to say, that whole thing about the self-love and not accepting and developing instead distractions to not deal with the stuff that we don't like about ourselves. To tap into that is what we call shadow work, because basically what it is that the parts that we didn't really want to accept about ourselves, we pushed them away so that we wouldn't have to recognize them. And we pushed them away into what Carl Jung called the shadow. So shadow work is not something obscure. It's simply facing the things that we don't want to face. This is very hard because it's no longer in our conscious mind. So it's not just saying like, okay, I'm just going to face it now. There's like a whole process around it. And it probably takes a long time for most people, I would say, because we've just been so trained to not deal with it. Okay, so this is the starting point of developing resilience, as in thriving in order to instead of just surviving in our environment. And it is not complicated, but it takes commitment. And so it means starting with acceptance, starting with this is where I'm at today, this is who I am, this is just who I'm going to have to be with for now, and accept that this is me. And then using the different tools of unraveling self, get that, breaking that shell that's too small for you. And then once you've come down to the I, then it's the whole nurturing of that, obviously, in itself, because then what do we do with that, But that's a whole different, because you've already been listening now for over 10 minutes, so you're probably swapping for another video soon. All right, thank you. Have a good day.